When day comes, we ask ourselves, where can we find light in this never-ending shade? The loss we carry, a sea we must wade. We brave the belly of the beast. We've learned that quiet isn't always peace, and the norms and notions of what just isn't always justice. These are the opening lines of Amanda Gorman's 2021 poem, The Hill We Climb, which she recited at the inauguration of Joe Biden. With Amanda Gorman, we step into a new era of inaugural poetry. We had the 60s era with JFK and Robert Frost. We had Bill Clinton with Maya Angelou and Miller Williams in the 90s. And then we had the Obama era with Elizabeth Alexander and Richard Blanco. Amanda Gorman, as we've talked about several times in this video series, is the youngest of the inaugural poets. She was serving as the Youth Poet Laureate of America, which basically meant that she was chosen to be a consultant in poetry to the Library of Congress, particularly as a young person. So she was chosen when she was still a teenager. Now, we've talked in this channel before about a lot of stigma, particularly against Gorman, given that she's young, and given that, in the opinion of both, I think, the literary establishment and also the political establishment, especially those who weren't fans of Biden, Amanda Gorman was seen as a disgrace, an embarrassment, et cetera, et cetera. I think that with the perspective of looking at from Frost to Blanco, we can see that Gorman is continuing on in the inaugural poetry tradition. I made an argument a few videos ago, a bit in the heat of the moment, arguing that we can discern formal poetic and rhetorical patterns in her poem, just as we can in many contemporary poems, and that we should see it as legitimately poetry. I got some pushback saying, well, she's untested, she's not worthy of praising. My point was not that she's the greatest poet writing, but that she's legitimately practicing the art of poetry. And so I want to look at her poem in a little more detail and see in particular how she's interacting with the inaugural tradition. Take the lines I just quoted. When day comes, we ask ourselves, where can we find light in this never-ending shade? This sounds a lot like the opening of Richard Blanco's One Today, which was read 10 years before, a little more than 10 years before, in 2009. One sun rose on us today, kindled over our shores. So we have this idea of morning coming. This sounds actually a lot like what Elizabeth Alexander wrote a few years before. Each day we go about our business, walking past each other, catching each other's eyes, or not, about to speak or speaking. So this idea of day coming, and each day and the morning being the time that we begin or we focus on in the inaugural poem. This has a heritage going back to Alexander and Blanco. In fact, it goes all the way back to Maya Angelou, who ends her poem on the pulse of morning with the words "good morning." So Gorman is picking up on this. And yet she's seeing that there's a shade that's covering over the morning. Now, Gorman has talked about how she wrote The Hill We Climb, first in direct response to the January 6th situation in the Capitol. And you can see that there's a turmoil and a worry in this poem. If we look a little after what I read, she says, somehow we weathered and witnessed a nation that isn't broken but simply unfinished. We, the successors of a country and a time where a skinny black girl descended from slaves and raised by a single mother can dream of becoming president, only to find herself reciting for one. We talked about this personal turn that Blanco has in his poem, where he speaks as himself and talks about his mother and his mother's heritage passing on to him, and now him reading in front of the president and in front of the nation. And so Gorman is picking up on the Blanco tradition there. Now, if we want to nitpick or talk about successful or less successful sections of Gorman's poetry, I think that Gorman is really interested in pushing wordplay to its limit. So we have that what just is isn't always just is. It's okay. It works okay. I don't think it's her cleverest pun, but she's trying out a lot. And here's something that I really want to emphasize. I think Miller Williams, Maya Angelou to some extent, Richard Blanco to less of an extent, certainly Elizabeth Alexander, were criticized for writing poetry that wasn't very sonically interesting. I think Blanco has a lushness to the language, and there's a monumentality to the imagery in Maya Angelou's, but there's not a lot of fun and wordplay in most inaugural poetry. And Gorman is really playing with words. Now, some of those word plays are a little tried and true, and yet she gives us so many of them that there's a lot to like. So we've already looked at the section where she talks about we need to glade the hill we climb. Glade the hill we climb. Glade is being used very interestingly as a verb there. But I want to look at the very end to really show how her wordplay and her rhythmic structures I find inspiring. Now, they're not as complicated as, say, the wordplay or the rhythmic structures of someone like Gerard Manley Hopkins or Gwendolyn Brooks at her most virtuosic. And yet, I really want those who think, oh, that was just a bunch of slogans. You know, there wasn't a poetic line in there. Listen to the end of this poem. One thing is certain, if we merge mercy with might and might with right, then love becomes our legacy and change our children's birthright. So let us leave behind a country better than the one we were left. Every breath from my pounded chest, we will raise this wounded world into a wondrous one. We will rise from the golden hills of the west. We will rise from the windswept northeast, where our forefathers first realized revolution. We will rise from the lake-rimmed cities of the Midwestern states. We will rise from the sun-baked south. We will rebuild, reconcile, and recover, and every known nook of our nation and every corner called our country, our people diverse and beautiful, will emerge battered and beautiful. When day comes, we step out of the shade of flame and unafraid. The new dawn balloons as we free it, for there was always light if we're brave enough to see it, if only we're brave enough to be it. Now, there are some pretty easy rhymes here, see it and be it. There's repetition of the word beautiful, which is a standard term. But every breath from my bronze-pounded chest, we will raise this wounded world into a wondrous one. There's a sonic density there. None of the words you have to look up in the dictionary, but I can't help but be impressed and inspired by the rhythm and the lushness of the sound. And it does remind me of writers more like Hopkins or Eliot. The unstilled world still turned about the center of the silent word. This looping of W sounds. I love this. We will rise. We will rise. We will rise. We talked about anaphora, the rhetorical tradition, both of the abolitionists, of the founding fathers, and of the Greco-Roman classical period. She's doing this again. But this, we will rise from the golden hills of the west. We will rise from the windswept northeast. We will rise from the lake-rimmed cities of the Midwestern states. This west, northeast, midwest, south. This is going back to Blanco, who talks about the sun rising over America, and you see all the regions of America. But it's also going back to the I Have a Dream speech, where King envisions all these beautiful places in America that are complicated politically and historically, and is calling them to a better future. So Amanda Gorman's poem, I think there's a poetic maturity that I think she's going to continue growing into that you can find in writers like Maya Angelou, Miller Williams, and Robert Frost that she doesn't have yet. But I remain impressed by the playfulness of the language, by the willingness to lean into rhyme, regular rhythm, repeated rhetorical structures, and to try out wordplay like justice and just is. They don't always work, but then again, let's be honest, Hopkins wordplays don't always work, let alone those of poets in between the talent of Hopkins, one of our great geniuses of language, and Gorman, who I think is a very promising poet. So this ends our exploration into inaugural poetry. I'm very curious to see what happens next. Don't mean to get political here, but I'd love to see a president other than a Democratic president pick a poet to read an inauguration. I think that would be very interesting. I think it's curious that only Democratic presidents have invited poets. Whatever the case, whoever should be reading poetry that isn't, I encourage you, if you like any of these poems in particular, Frost, Blanco, Alexander, Angelou, Gorman, Williams, look more into their poetry. All of them have multiple books of poetry that you can read, that you can explore. Check down at the links at the within the descriptions of each video. I'm going to try and put links to the videos of these poets reading. It's interesting to hear the poets read their work. I think some of them are better at reading their work than others. Amanda Gorman is a tested and polished spoken word poet. She was very much steeped in the spoken word tradition where you're performing your poem, and that's the main experience of the poem, the performance of it, as opposed to just written on the page. And you can see that. Somebody like Robert Frost, he's not actually very good at reading his own poem. In that video, Robert Frost did know how to read poetry quite well, but the video of him reading, he's on TV reading maybe for one of the first times in his life, and it's a little awkward. You can see people get more used to being recorded and being on camera. Thanks again. Agree, disagree, comment down below. If you like these videos, you can subscribe to the channel. We'll be putting out more looking at poetry, both of our modern era and of eras past. Thanks so much.